Hi, welcome. In this session, we're going to look briefly at public transport and how to improve it for babies, toddlers, and caregivers. But first, I wanted to just briefly refresh ourselves on the trip characteristics of caregivers. And the first key determinant of how they travel is whether or not they travel with or without young children. ITDP Brazil did some focus group work in Recife, where they found that caregivers were more likely to take public transport if they were traveling with a child. And this is partly because traveling with a child is much slower, as you can see from the quote on the left. It's also because the walking conditions are not great. There's maybe not sidewalks or not enough room on a sidewalk to travel with a baby or toddler, as you see from the quote and the picture on the right. So they take public transport, but there's also challenges for them when they do. So what you see, these are two pictures, one's from India, one's from Brazil, but the quote is from the caregivers in Recife. There's not enough space to wait safely. Oftentimes you find people waiting for public transport in the street or on crowded sidewalks, and these are chaotic situations for caregivers when they're traveling with young children. The other component that poses sometimes a challenge when accessing public transport is that they're traveling with children and goods. So, carrying a baby as you're trying to light into a bus, going up steps, especially if it's a big step up, can be really challenging. Alternatively, as you see on the picture on the right, traveling with a family where you have a baby in a stroller, but you also have goods in the stroller and you're carrying a toddler. Again, those can become challenges when accessing public transport. And just a brief note that when we're talking about public transport, we're talking about the full spectrum of public transport, whether it be shared 2- and 3-wheelers to minivans and minibuses, all the way up to buses and rail. It's the full spectrum. And the reason why this is important to note and take note of right now is that most cities in the world do not have formal public transport systems, and most public transport is actually provided by intermediate and informal modes. Public transport can offer a lot of opportunities and benefits for caregivers traveling with babies and toddlers if done right. So the question is, how do we do it right? And we're going to say through 10-minute transport, public transport. And this is the framework we introduced a while back. Basically, 10-minute public transport is one where people have no more than a 10-minute wait for public transport that's within a walkable distance. And the reason why this is really important is because with 10-minute public transport, usually 10 minutes is the threshold where people feel comfortable just walking up to a stop or a station and waiting for a service. You think, okay, it comes every 10 minutes. I have a high likelihood of catching a bus soon. If it's over 10 minutes, that's when you start to have to schedule and plan. And then what you see is a lot of times, if it's every half hour or every hour, then you really need to schedule your trip. But with 10-minute public transport, it reduces travel times and reduces waiting times. So that makes the trip less long, which is really important when traveling with babies and toddlers because they are very time sensitive. And then it also increases travel flexibility, which is really important for caregivers because they're very time constrained. So 10-minute transport is that foundation for good service, frequent service. But it's more than just that. That's the foundation and the starting point, but there's also 5 key principles to make public transport work better for babies, toddlers, and caregivers. And we're going to go through them one by one. The first principle is network and service design, and this is the foundation. Good service and a good network, these are the foundations for a good public transport system. It begins with a fine-grained street grid, and of course it includes frequent 10 minutes, all day and all week, including the weekend service. And this is particularly important because caregivers may be traveling more often in off-peak hours or on weekends. And it needs to be a comprehensive connected network so that caregivers can access the whole city through public transport. And this can be accomplished in part by integrating all the different forms of public transport into a system. And so what you see, and this includes things like bike share, which is what you see in the picture on the left from Fortaleza. They have a bike share station co-located next to their bus station. It also includes things like dedicated bus lanes, which helps with the reliability and predictability of the service. So the vehicles aren't stuck in congestion or traffic. They're not jockeying at the curb. For passengers, it becomes a safer system. And finally, the third piece of these foundational things is the vehicle. So you want to have cleaner vehicles. You want to have priority seating in those vehicles for caregivers traveling with babies and toddlers. You also want to have level boarding in the vehicle, so you don't have to hop up steps carrying a child and goods into the vehicle. So these are the key components of the first principle. The second principle is station and stop design. And so basically, this is the other key part of the infrastructure. It's the visceral experience of the system. It's where you wait. It's where you find information. These are critical places, and they should be considered civic infrastructure of sorts. They can help anchor communities and neighborhoods. They can be public spaces. But the first key component of station and stop design is that there is dedicated space for the stations or stops. It's not that it's put in the middle of a sidewalk or next to the road. They have its own space, and it's sufficient and ample for waiting. That also includes things like seating, shade, weather protection that makes the waiting environment a little bit more comfortable. And then it also includes level boarding. So this is the flip side. You want level boarding in the vehicle, so you don't have to jump up steps when you're in the bus. But you also want level boarding from the station platform into the vehicle, like what you see in the middle picture in Ichang. So level boarding is really important. And then finally, you want to have universal accessibility into the station and stop. And this is what you see in the picture on the right, where you have a ramp going into the elevated platform that is at grade with the bus, the low floor bus that comes there. Other components of stations and stops include things like play elements, bright colors, trying to make the station more attractive and engaging for babies and toddlers. And this is what you see on the left-hand side picture. But you also want to include things like green infrastructure, like what you see on the right. And so green infrastructure is important partly because it helps clean the air, which is really important for babies and toddlers. So it helps with air quality, but it also helps with cooling down that area. So again, if you're having people waiting, it lowers the temperature so it's not as hot. And then it also can help with things like flooding and extreme heat with shade protection. So as climate change accelerates, these are going to become ever more important. The third principle is safety, and safety is a really one of the biggest influences on caregivers when they travel. So making sure that you're improving personal security for caregivers is going to be critical to making public transport work better for them. And this is especially true for women and especially true for older people. So you start by doing safety by design. So you have really well-lit stations like what you see on the right. And then you also have really well-lit access to the stations. So you feel safe approaching the station as well. And then another thing you can do is have visually porous stations and stops, like what you see on the right with transparent panes and clear sight lines. Another key component to safety is having reporting mechanisms, whether it be gender violence or urban violence. That can be things like panic buttons in the stations, having apps on your phone that you can report crimes, having SMS services. It can also be having public safety personnel in the station or stop. It can also be things like having CCTV, like what's shown here in Peshawar, that acts as a deterrent for crime. Finally, all staff need to be trained on how to respond to incidents of gender violence and urban violence. And they also there needs to be an awareness within the transport system personnel about gender violence. Additionally, they need to be also trained on the needs of caregivers traveling with babies and toddlers. We've seen drivers get really exasperated and be even hostile to caregivers as they try to navigate into buses with babies and toddlers and goods. So it's equally as important to train staff on the needs of caregivers traveling with babies and toddlers. The fourth principle is fare policy. And affordability is typically the first lens that people use to make travel decisions, and having an equitable fare policy will help increase the accessibility and ease of use for caregivers within the public transport system. Financial burdens weigh heavily on households. So again, having equitable fare policies such as targeted discounts, that can be for low income, that can even be for caregivers. For example, Istanbul, the example on the bottom left, has developed a Mama Card where you can apply if you have a child under 4 and you're a mother. You can apply to get a Mama Card that gives you free credits every month to use on public transport. Free fares for children also help alleviate the burden on households when traveling as families. Fare policies should also help facilitate trip chaining with things like transfer windows. The other key component with fare policy is having off-board fare collection. Again, that the stressful moment of entering the vehicle, carrying your kid and your goods, and then also having to pay. If you can remove some of the stress of that interaction and have off-board fare collection, that can be done through barrier-controlled means like a turnstile, which is pictured in the right from Bogota. And that's an extra wide turnstile, which is nice when you're traveling with a baby or toddler and you're walking hand in hand, or if you're traveling with a stroller and you need a wider turnstile to get through. You can also do ticket vending kiosks, digital payments. There are other ways to do off-board fare collection as well. But that really helps caregivers traveling with babies and toddlers. The fifth principle is integration. And so you want to increase accessibility and ease of use by informational and physical integration. And so caregivers often have multiple destinations that they're trying to get to and need to use multiple services to reach them. So by co-locating different transport services close by, it facilitates those transfers and connections for caregivers. And they should be designed like what you see from Jakarta, with really nice wayfinding that shows you where the different services are and a really nice walking connection between them. So it's safe, it's comfortable, it's not chaotic. That's what you're trying to do with physical co-location and integration. The other side of it is informational integration. And so unlike commuters who take the same trip every day to the same destination, caregivers will be traveling to non-typical destinations. So they're going to need to figure out how to get there. So that requires trip planning. So having trip planning tools available will really facilitate those trips, because they're not going to be that kind of route routine that commuters do. The other thing is having very clear signage at the stations and stops and on the vehicles, whether it be totems, whether it's, in the picture on the right, you can see there's an electronic board that shows all the different services that are showing up, what time they're going to arrive, so you can have a better sense of the expectation for waiting. It has a totem that tells you that this is the rapid ride stop. So there's a bunch of different things there at the station that help you navigate the system. Also on the vehicle, you can have route strips that show you the stations, have announcements of like the next stop coming up. All of these things will help caregivers navigate through the system. And that's it. Those are the 5 key principles of 10-minute transport. And I just want to close by saying public transport is public space. It's a civic space, and it reflects our values and the value we put on the public as well. So it would be amazing if public transport could really fully embody the true public, the full public, which includes caregivers traveling with babies and toddlers, and hopefully 10-minute transport, public transport, and these 5 key principles can help show the way. Thank you.